All right, I guess we could begin.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this is the intro to theory debate lecture. Uh, I'm Evan Burkeen, and Jeremiah Cohn will be helping me. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm the first speaker for American. One second.
I will introduce myself in the meantime. I'm Jeremiah. I'm the first speaker for Summit CY. My partner and I read a lot of theory at TOC last year. We got pretty deep into outrounds with it. And then I've done LD at a couple of tournaments this year, and I mainly read theory there. And then besides that, in the couple of PF tournaments I've also attended, I've read some theory there too. Yeah, and I say just adapt on Reddit. It's really good advice.
Okay.
Oh my
So
God, Evan,
I'm.
your mic is your mic is quite bad.
Oh, is it like that bad?
Yeah, yeah. It's okay. It's okay.
Okay, I'll just speak clearly. My name's Evan Burkeen. I'm the first speaker for American Heritage BF. My partner Odin and I read a lot of theory on the circuit if we have the judges for it, and we specialize in disclosure theory. But I have a broad knowledge of a lot of other theories as well. Um, if you have any question at all, if you could just put them in the chat, Jeremiah or I will like get to answer them after like each slide. So like, don't be afraid to put any questions in the chat. So we'll go right ahead. What is theory and what does it mean in terms of debate? So theoretical arguments are like progressive argumentation. You've probably heard of them. And it's basically debate about debate. It's about the norms you want to set in the debate or norms you think that's just better for the debate space overall. So theory is basically offering a norm you have, then you have reasons why that norm should be followed, and then along with other things like reasons why the opponent should be dropped for not following that norm. So it's just basically saying, hey, I want you to follow X norm, and you're not following that norm, therefore you should lose, or maybe you should like lose that argument, etc. Jeremiah, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I guess like an example would be something like formal close theory, which is a little like unusual on the PF circuit. But the idea would be like debaters should not wear formal clothes for like XYZ reasons. Maybe it's exclusionary to certain people. And thus they should lose to encourage them to like not wear formal clothes in the future. Another example is like paraphrasing theory, which you've probably heard of, which is just you should read off of cut cards or use direct quotes and not like paraphrase evidence, and you should lose for doing so. It will probably have an example of that shell in the slideshow.
Yeah. So let me move on. What is the purpose of theory? Why do people read it? And is it a good way to call out abuse? People read theory to combat abuse. Let's say the opponents are being abusive, they're not following a norm that you want them to follow. Then you read theory on them in order to make sure they change that practice in the future. They lose the round because of that. They lose their argument because of that. For example, like a really good example of a theory like that is like misgendering theory. So if the opponent misgenders you, you can read theory that they should not misgender you because of reasons why that's bad, and then they should be dropped for that, right? Theory is meant to call out abuses to make sure the round is more fair, more educational, and just safer overall. And I think it is a good way to call out abuse because the number one thing that drives debaters are like pretty much wins and losses. A lot of people are driven by whether they lose or win in a debate round. Thus, if you read theory on them and they lose on the theory, they might consider like changing their norm. For example, if I read paraphrasing that you may not read paraphrased evidence, or so you have to read cut cards. If you lose on paraphrase theory, in the future you will like read cut cards. So I think it is a pretty good way of calling out abuse, and that's happened in the past.
I agree. It also kind of goes beyond the stigma that a lot of theory has on the circuit. I know a lot of people think that like theory just exists to like get cheap wins or like like to beat teams that don't know what's going on. And I think that the issue is that like theory is like kind of the only way to call out abuse any round, right? Because if someone does something bad, I can't just like tell the judge to drop them, right? So at that point, theory does become necessary, and it kind of like surpasses the stigma that exists, even if some people do use theory just like win rounds or whatever. But it's also probably a pretty good incentive for you to thus like learn theory so you can also win rounds if people do bad stuff in them.
Yeah. So theory in public forum. Can you read a law in PF, and will judges be receptive to those arguments? As many of you know, or if you don't know, theory is very common in Lincoln Douglas, LD, and policy, where it's kind of like common to hear a few theory arguments being made in the round. However, that's kind of more recent to public forum, i.e., like most public forum debates are topical stuff. But in the past few years, the overall PF national circuit has become much more progressive, and theory has been like a lot more accepted. So a lot of like judges will be less receptive to those theoretical arguments because they're more used to like substantive debates. But like there are more judges in the pool who are like more willing to evaluate theory. A lot of like first year routes, for example, will say, I do not have much example or much experience evaluating theory, but I will evaluate theory. So overall, the circuit's becoming more like friendly to theory.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
and in general, that doesn't mean like judges are receptive to like really silly theory arguments, right? Like for instance, like debaters must not wear shoes, or like debaters should wear like a Santa hat. It just means that like if you want to like run like stuff like paraphrasing and disclosure, chances are you'll be able to get more wins with arguments like that than you would have been able to in the last few years. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. So theory shell. A theory shell is the way you structure your theory arguments. So it's just how you usually read them in round. You can read theory in any part of a round. You can read like constructive, rebuttal. I guess you could read it in summary if like something really bad happens, or final focus, but it's probably too late to develop those theoretical arguments. So the majority of theory is read in constructive and rebuttal.
Yeah.
So there are 5 parts to a shell, and we'll go through each specific part of a shell. I know that can be a little confusing at first, but like if you have like any questions at all, just put in the chat and be pleasured to like answer them. So there are 5 key parts. There's the interpretation, there's the violation, the standards, the voters, and then the paradigm issues.
Yeah.
So let's go to interpretation first. And what does it mean in terms of debate? Interpretation is just that the norm that you want the opposing team to follow. So it's saying like, hey, I have this interpretation for debate, and I want the opponent to follow that interpretation for debate. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll be using the example of paraphrasing theory to like develop a theory shell and work our way through it. So easy interpretation, debaters must introduce all evidence into the round as direct quotes. So that's basically saying they cannot just paraphrase all of their evidence. They must read it as direct quotes or like cut card format. So that's just the interpretation, the norm you want the opposing team to follow.
Yep.
You want to be very specific with your interpretation, because if there's like any way the other team can like weasel out of meeting your interpretation, even though they didn't, that's going to be like really bad, really upsetting. So you want to make your interpretation as specific as possible. Make sure like you have a good chance of winning on that norm, and like so you can like spread that norm in the future.
Yeah. On the flip side, though, if you are hitting a theory shell and they have like a really non-specific norm, right? Like debaters must not paraphrase or something, you can figure out ways to meet the interpretation and say you didn't violate it, or like you are already following the norm because the theory shell is so non-specific. And that's a pretty good way to like beat back or beat theory if someone runs it against you.
But yeah, so when creating a theory shell, that's exactly the reason why you need your interpretations to be very specific. It can't just be vague. Can't just say stop paraphrasing. You need to say debaters must introduce all evidence into the round as direct quotes. You can always change around your interps, but just make sure they're specific so the other team can't just like get out of that. The next part of a theory shell is the violation. Violation is pretty self-explanatory. It's just saying that they violated the norm that you wanted to set. So they violated our norm, and then they violated by, for example, not reading direct quotes. So here's a violation. B is a violation. They paraphrase their evidence. They do not read it as direct quotes. So it's just saying why they do not meet your interpretation of debate.
And then generally, if you're running a theory shell, especially if it's something like disclosure that relies on like the wiki page, in your doc with the theory shell, you just want to have a screenshot of the violation occurring. So that way that there's proof that it's happening. And they can't just be like, we don't violate, like, here's an example of us not violating, right? You have the proof that they did it, and thus you have proof that they violated, and you can win off the theory shell.
Okay. Next, oh, let me go back one. This is probably the most important part of a theory shell, but there may be like other parts, but here's like the bulk of the theory shell, the standards. These standards are reasons to prefer your interpretation over like the status quo over like the opponent's interpretation. It's just reasons to follow your interpretation. It's just a warrant, right? So in typical like arguments, you have claim, then you have your warrant, and then your impact. The standard is exactly the warrant, the reason why your opponents should follow your interpretation. There are like a lot of standards. There are a lot of common ones. If you want me to explain one of them, just like put it in the chat, but I'll just quickly go through some of them. There's like academic integrity, there's clash, there's strat skew, there's ground, there's limits, reciprocity, topic education, small schools. There's a lot more, but these are all reasons why the opponents have been kind of abusive in the round and why your interpretation is just on net better for debate.
Yeah. And a couple of things about standards. There's like common standards, but honestly, standards are not like a defined thing, right? There's not like delinks or turns. A standard can just be kind of like anything you want. The only thing is that the standard has to impact out to like fairness or education or like safety in the round, right? So for instance, with something like clash, you say they are making it harder for us to interact with their arguments, which means that there's less education in the round than there would be if we were following our norm. Right, so your standard can literally be anything. I wrote some like funny theory shells for online tournaments over the summer, and the standard was like vibing or something, and it impacted to like education, because if everyone's having a good time, they probably want to interact with the round more, right? But the point is, it's like a really silly standard, but it still impacts out to like fairness, education, or safety. So it's a valid standard that I can actually win off of. And that's kind of a litmus test for any standard you want to write or any standard your opponent's reading. It can exist, but it probably has to impact out to education or fairness for them to actually be able to win off of it, or for you to be able to win off of it.
Yeah, well, exactly what Jeremiah said. Just the warrant for why they should be following your interpretation. So going along with the paraphrasing example, here are two standards. The first standard is academic integrity, and when they paraphrase their evidence, this allows them to insert what they think the author thinks, which allows misconstruing of evidence. And second is topic education. Because they may be reading fake evidence, that decreases my education since they are saying fake things and I don't learn anything about the real world, right? Those are the warrants. Those are not probably not the best warrants, but those are examples of warrants in a theory shell that you would read. Just reasons to prefer your interpretation. Anything, Jeremiah, or no?
Yeah, that's pretty good. And you can see like these both impact out to like education, right? Because academic integrity is like, oh, they're misconstruing the evidence, means that I don't get what the author actually thinks. It's worse for education. And topic education is like, I'm not learning anything about the real world, so it's less educational than it would be if you weren't paraphrasing. Yeah.
So here are your voters. Voters are kind of like the impacts of your standards, right? So if we go back to the claim warrant impact structure of arguments and debate, these are the impacts. You're saying what is harmed in the debate space by them not following your interpretation. And as Jeremiah just said, it links back to the standards you read. The most common standards, or most common voters rather, are fairness and education. They're saying you hurt fairness in the round, you make the round unfair, or you make the round uneducational. Those are not the only two voters. There's other voters like safety, but the two most common voters you will hear in a theory shell are fairness and education. So if we go to our example, dear the voters, one is fairness. Because they are paraphrased, they have skewed my ability to participate in the round, thus decreasing fairness. Fairness is a key to in any game to ensure there is a proper winner or loser. And second is education. Because they're paraphrased, they might be lying about their evidence, which decreases my topical education. Education is key because that's the main reason schools fund debate and is the core benefit of the activity. There's a few missing warrants in here, but the basis is that you just have two impacts in the round. Why them not following your interpretation of the debate space has harmed the debate space, has made it either unfair or has made it uneducational.
And also, what's really important about voters is that you have to link it to something that's like related to debate or related to the judge's rule, right? Because this is the part of the round where you were saying now it is the judge's obligation to vote on this argument, like before the substance layer of the debate round, right? So, for instance, for fairness, you say fairness is key in any game to ensure there's a proper winner or loser. The inherent argument here is that debate is a game, and thus it must be evaluated fairly. And then for education, you say it's like the key benefit you get out of debate, so we should do things that are more educational to make the best activity. And then the second thing is that it's the core benefit, or it's the main reason schools fund debate. So if the debate is not educational, schools probably won't fund it, and then debate goes away.
Okay, those are the 4 top parts of the theory shell. That's what you've probably heard, and probably the easier ones. But now we're going on to the paradigm issues. So now,
really quick.
yeah.
Other Evan asked a question. So in your voter, you're supposed to explain how your standard links in, not just why. Like you say, education is a voter. Yeah. So the voters should probably do both, at least in PF. So you just want to like, I guess, point out like how you link in, right? For instance, Evan, if you go back, like the example here is like, because they've paraphrased, they've like skewed my ability to participate, thus decreasing fairness. Now here's why fairness matters. You don't have to do this. If you do a really good job in your standards of explaining how your standards link into fairness and education, your voter section kind of just make the blanket claim that they're important, and then later on in the round you can connect them. But it's probably a good idea, in your voters to just be like, they have done this thing, it was bad, now this is why this like thing matters, or just like quickly summarize your standards again if you like really wanted to.
Right. Adding on to what Jeremiah said, it's really important that your standards really link to a voter. So if your standard is talking about learning about the real world and talking about like learning stuff, that's just going to be inherently an education impact or an education voter that doesn't really impact out to fairness that much because you're learning things. That's education. So you really need to link your standard to your voter, explain like why they link, and then explain the impact, which is just the voter. Paradigm issues. So paradigm issues are, so the judge has heard your argument now, and so the judge needs to know how to properly evaluate your theory arguments. And there are 3 paradigm issues in the theory shell. There's 1, drop the debater / drop the argument. 2, competing interpretations versus reasonability. And 3, RVIs or reverse voting issues versus no reverse voting issues. But we'll explain each one. So if we go to drop the debater / drop the argument, what do they aim to do? What's the difference, and what should you be going for? Like if you're reading theory. So drop the debater and drop the argument are pretty much the opponent's punishments for not following your norm. So let's say you're winning your theory shell. You prove that your interpretation is good for debate. You prove your standards. You prove that they're harming the debate activity. Now they need a punishment. So they're the 2 most common punishments, and like pretty much the biggest punishment is drop the debater. It's saying the opponent should lose for not following the interpretation that you offered. There's also drop the argument, which is very different. Drop the argument is basically saying drop the argument they read, but drop the debater is basically saying drop the whole debater instead of that just one argument. So when you're reading theory, you should probably go for drop the debater, because it's just, if you win the theory shell, that means you win the debate, provided you do like Wang across like why theory overpowers substance or other theory shells, for example. But drop the debater is just saying they should lose for not following our norm.
Yeah, and there's probably different circumstances where you use these. In general, you probably want to use drop the debater, because most debaters really only care about ballots, right? So if you're trying to set a norm, an L is a pretty good incentive for people to change. But sometimes drop the argument is good. For instance, if people read like a ton of DAs in second rebuttal, you can make a claim in first summary that that's bad for the activity because like it hurts the first summary's ability to engage, which hurts clash. So thus the judge should not evaluate all the disads that are read in second rebuttal. Because with a theory shell like that, it's kind of unlikely you'll be able to win off of that kind of theory shell. So the best thing you can do is just get them to drop the arguments that they've read.
Someone asked, wait, can you explain an RVI again? We haven't gone to RVI or reverse voting issue yet, but we'll cover that at the bottom of the paradigm issues. But it's just a reverse voting issue.
Yeah.
So here are the examples and the kind of the ones for both. Drop the debater to set norms in to deter future abuse. It's kind of what just Jeremiah just said. because debaters are really motivated by wins and losses. If they lose, they're probably going to change whatever like abusive thing they did in that round, and then drop the argument. Same thing Jeremiah said, is because it's like unsafe for a debate space, it's unfair, so drop all the arguments they read.
Yep.
So that's just, those are pretty much the punishments for the opposing team for not following your interpretation. Now we're on competing interpretations versus reasonability. You want to do that, Jeremiah?
Yeah, sure. So competing interps or CIs versus reasonability is a very important part of the theory shell. It basically tells the judge and the other team how the theory debate will play out. So competing interps, that model of the theory debate basically says that when you're responding to the theory shell, you need to read an interpretation of your own and then standards of your own, and then compare the standards you're reading versus the original standards read. This is a model that you probably prefer to reasonability, because what reasonability tells you is that like the judge should do a gut check on the shell, and if the shell seems like a good idea, they should vote for it, and if it doesn't, they shouldn't. And obviously you probably don't want this to happen if you're reading theory, because that means that the judge might randomly intervene against you, and you don't want it if you're responding to theory, because that also means that the judge might randomly intervene against you. And also the CI's model of debate makes the debate on the shell a lot cleaner, because it's just like any PF debate, you just do some warrant comparison on your standards. And Evan read a really great example, and I'll let him go over that.
Yeah. So I know it can be a little confusing, so I gave an example for like competing interpretations. So let's say I have this math teacher named Bob, and I really like despise Bob. He's not a good teacher at all. He's the reason I'm failing my class. And I say Bob is the worst teacher in the school. We have to assume that Bob is the worst teacher in the school if we're not given any sort of alternative, which is how competing interpretation plays out. So, or like on the flip side, we could say the best teacher in the school, right? Bob is the best teacher. So if I'm offering a norm and I say it's the best norm, and the opposing team does not give a differing norm, then you're proving, all you have to do is win a little offense on your side of the shell, and you're proving that your interpretation is better for debate. And that's just how competing interpretation pulls out, or like plays out. They have to prove that their interpretation has a net benefit compared to yours. And as reasonable, like just as Jeremiah said, reasonability is just saying as long as one side has like a reasonable interpretation, that you shouldn't really evaluate the theory debate. And that's bad because it like increases judge intervention, that kind of stuff. So when you're going for a theory shell, you probably want to be going for competing interpretations, because if debate is about competing interpretations, the opposing team has to prove that their interpretation is better than yours.
Yep. And it also means that if you're the better theory team, you'll probably win, because you'll do better warrant comparison on the standards, and thus your interp will be better in the round.
So here are the warrants, and we just explained why it's kind of important. So the two warrants are, or four competing interpretations. The warrant for that is defaulted competing interpretations, because theories debate about models. If we prove our model of debate is slightly better than the opponent's model, then we should win. So it's just kind of like the example I gave you. If we prove that ours is just better, or if there is no alternative to our model, we must assume it is the best model for debate.
Another warrant you can read is you can say, you can like attack reasonability, right? You can be like, reasonability is bad because it invites judge intervention, which makes the round like less fair, or means that like we don't have a good time debating because the judge will just like flip a coin at the end of the round.
And on the flip side, the warrants for reasonability, like again, like in a debate round, you probably don't want to be going for reasonability. You want to make sure you're winning, that competing interpretations is the model for debate that you want. But like the warrant is like default to reasonability, being able to run 10 theory shells, which are all ridiculous, skews my ability to engage in the round. The judge should be reasonable and drop all their arguments. So it's basically saying that their arguments are unreasonable. For example, if they read stuff like frivolous theory, like shoe theory, or like they must they must specify which universe their arguments taken and like happen, and they read like lots of those, a lot of judges will be like, that's really unreasonable, you don't have to follow that. So that's why you would default to reasonability.
Yep.
All right, let's go to reverse voting issues. Jeremiah, you want to explain this?
Yeah, so reverse voting issues versus no RVIs is pretty simple. Winning reverse voting issues as like a team basically says that now we can win off of the shell. A good way to think of an RVI is basically like it's basically like a turn, right? So the team reading the theory shell wants to win the idea that there are no RVIs, or if the opponents win the shell, it is not a reason to vote for them. Um, and this is really important because if you win no RVIs, then theory is a no risk issue for you. You can read a theory shell and then not have any risk of losing off of it, meaning that you might as well read it every round. But if you're the team that is debating against the team reading a theory shell, you need to win RVIs because that means that if you win like your competing interp and your standards, you actually get a path to the ballot off of the shell. Um, yeah. So this is probably one of the most important parts of the shell because if it gets mishandled, there is either no offense off of the shell for you or offense off of the shell for the other team. So depending on if you are reading theory or debating against theory, this will still be probably one of the most important parts of the shell. Yeah.
Exactly what Jeremiah said. We can go for the warrants, but if you are reading theory, you want to read no RBIs to make sure the opposing team cannot win or beat back the theory shell and win the debate. And if you are reading like a counter interpretation, like just a competing interpretation, you want to prove that that you can win. So we'll go to the warrants for them. Theory is a reverse voting issue, so you would read this responding to theory. Not allowing RVIs allows them to read 5 theory shells on me and I have to respond to each one because each is a necessary but insufficient burden for me to meet, with no way for me to win. Allowing me to beat back a theory shell and win on it equalizes access to the, I said burden, but it's supposed to be like ballot, equalize just being able to, or I guess it is burden as well, but equalize access to the ballot for me to be able to win. And then theory is not a reverse voting issue because RVIs allow abusive debaters to bait theory and win on the theory flow and keep being abusive, which makes it a debate based on net worth. This warrants basically saying that if you allow reverse voting issues in debate, you pretty much allow really abusive debaters to bait theory and then win on the theory flow and they keep being abusive, which like kills theory in the debate space. So that's pretty much it. Those are like all the parts of a theory shell. If you want to go over like any slide at all, just put it in the chat. I'll be more than happy to go over one part. So I guess I can go through like each part of the, I guess we can go through like the paraphrasing or like all the warrants we gave and kind of give like a theory shell, how we would like read it.
Yeah. Yeah, we should probably just go over like the paraphrasing shell you're using as an example, just like all in one.
Yeah. So let's go back to interpretation. So this is how you would read an interpretation. So you would say, start off with the theory shell and you say the first like theory shell is paraphrasing theory. A is the interpretation. Debaters must introduce all evidence into the round as direct quotes. It's a violation. They paraphrase all of their evidence. C are the standards. One is academic integrity. When they paraphrase their evidence, this allows them to insert what the author thinks instead of, which allows misconstruing of the evidence. And second is public education. Because they may be reading fake evidence, that decreases my education since they're saying fake things and I don't learn anything about the real world. Here are the voters. One is fairness. Because they have paraphrased, they've skewed my ability to participate in the round, thus decreasing fairness. Fairness is key in any game to ensure there's a proper winner or loser. But second is education. Because they have paraphrased, they may be lying about evidence which decreases my topical education. Education is key because that's the main reason schools fund debate and is the core benefit of the activity.
Yep. And then
then
on the last slide, there's just like a fully written out or like fleshed out shell.
Okay, perfect. I'll just go to that one then. One second. Let me pull that up. Okay. Let me screen share again. Okay, so this is just a theory shell. I ended at voter. Then you go to drop the debater to deter future abuse, and it sets a positive norm, sets precedent. No RVIs because it allows debaters to run abusive positions and bait theory, which kills like prevalence of theory, doesn't let debaters do call out abuse in the round. Default to competing interpretations, reasonability invites judge intervention. Theory is a debate about models. If we prove our model is slightly better than their model, then we should win. So this would just kind of be a theory shell you would read in round.
Yep.
So yeah, that's pretty much this lecture. We might give like one about responding to theory if people are interested. But any questions at all, I'll go over another slide or anything. I'll go over like any of the parts. Like if like any question about reading theory in PF, there are like some judges who may not be like welcoming how you should like introduce in a round, etc. Any questions at all, please just like put in the chat.
No, tricks are not theory.
Tricks. So Jeremiah, would you like to explain what tricks are and like why they're different from theory?
So tricks are not theory. Tricks are just like a bunch of random one-line blips you would read in constructive and then hope your opponent undercovers them, because if any of them are dropped, you auto win the round. In LD, people will read like tricky underviews with theory, but they are not the same. Generally, tricks are like not a thing you should read, and they're pretty bad for debate, I think. On the flip side, theory is probably a pretty good thing because they're usually setting good norms. Is there any legitimate reason to run tricks? I don't know. If you're doing LD and you really hate the event, then go for it. But I do not recommend it in PF.
Yeah. I think the main differentiation between tricks and theory is tricks are not like they're not really providing a norm for debate. They're not providing an interpretation. Some tricks are like, because of this paradox, you automatically affirm or negate the resolution, which is not the same as offering an interpretation that the opposing team should follow or not. So that's like the main differentiation between tricks and theory. Someone asked, is anything commonly run other than Disclo and Para in public forum? Disclo and paraphrasing are definitely the most common. I know a lot of people read content warning theory, saying like their arguments may have like sensitive information or like stuff, and they did not give a content warning for it, which is a reason to drop them. There's like spec theory on some topics. For example, I'll give a good if everyone like understood the UBI topic, should the United States institute a universal basic income? A spec argument would be like, or specify, spec is short for specify, it says they must specify what arguments or like how much a UBI is, how it's going to be distributed, that kind of stuff. So spec and content warnings are not run as much, but they're definitely ran. There's also like misgendering theory. Jeremiah, do you have like any other examples?
Yeah, I mean, there's also like stuff like silly stuff like maybe corona theory. But besides that, like if you're doing PF, the only thing you really need to worry about are Disclo and Para, because as long as like you're being a good person and like not misgendering people and giving content warnings for your arguments, like you're not going to run into any other theory.
Yeah, it's just those are definitely the most common. For example, like I'm like pretty much all I do is read disclosure theory. I like disclosure theory. I think it's a true argument. Jeremiah reads disclosure and paraphrase, I believe.
Yeah, I like paraphrasing a lot more, but
yeah. So, but those are definitely the most common. You might, I would really doubt that you would hit something else other than like you're just being a decent human being. But if you're going to hit like a theory shell, it's probably going to be paraphrasing or disclosure.
Yeah. You should probably never argue to default reasonability if you're reading theory. However, if your opponents read like a lot of really, really silly stuff, right? For instance, maybe you'll hit some like, I don't know, some people who are just trolling in a tournament and are like reading like, must not wear shoes or like must like play music in first constructive. Then maybe you want to argue for like default to reasonability and make some arguments that this like the theory shell is irreasonable or is like kind of silly. Or maybe like their theory shell is kind of like impossible to meet, right? For instance, in LD, people run arguments that you have to like specify certain positions that you take as the affirmative. And one of the most common responses is that that would be not reasonable because I would have to like specify too many positions, and thus I wouldn't be able to read like a case. So that would be a time where you'd want to argue for reasonability because your main response to the shell is that it is not reasonable. But if you are the team reading theory, you almost always want to win yes counter interps because that means that the debate is a lot cleaner and the judge won't randomly intervene against you. Yeah. And it also means that you never get into this weird debate where they're like arguing that your shell isn't reasonable and you have to just kind of like say it is. Makes it a lot easier to debate. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just basically like if the opponent team, like if it's a lot of like silly ridiculous stuff, like for example, you have to wear a Santa hat, you must dress up as Mickey Mouse, you must like not wear shoes. A lot of this stuff will probably be ridiculous to a judge, and by arguing for reasonability, you're saying, judge, just be reasonable. All of these arguments are ridiculous. Don't buy them. So that's when you would argue for reasonability. But for the majority of shells, like disclosure and paraphrasing, you almost never want to argue for reasonability. You probably always want to argue for competing interpretations.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, I'll wait like a minute, and if nobody else has questions, I guess I'll like end it. If you have any questions like after, you can always ask me in the PF Discord. I'll put my tag in chat, or you can always just PM me something.
Yeah. Of a counterinterp to disclosure theory. Yeah, sure. A counterinterp to disclosure theory I would read is probably I'm a little biased. I personally think disclosure is a very good norm and you should do it. But counterinterps to disclosure theory you can give are stuff like open source disclosure. For instance, your disclosure norm is bad because first three, last three words means that I can't access your evidence if it's paywalled. So you should open source your evidence instead so I can see the entire article or the entirety of the article you read. And that way I can actually like do stuff like check for, bad citations or whatever, or if your card is bad. Or another thing you could do is like full text, which has the same idea. If you don't disclose, you probably don't open source. Yeah, but you should probably disclose. Like minimum first three, last three words.
I think my personal favorite, like I am also biased. I think disclosure is a good norm, but the two, if I were going against disclosure, I would read one, debaters just must not disclose, and I would read reasons why like disclosing on the wiki or just disclosing in general are bad. I would say two, debaters must ask before the round to disclose or like disclose on some sort of other medium other than like the wiki. Or I guess a third one is schools with less than like 2 entries should not have to disclose.
Yeah. If you're going to go along like that kind of route, another thing you can do is you can just read like debaters must only disclose like contact information or something, because then you can just like ask us for our case and that probably solves back for all the benefits of the shell anyway. Yeah. I'm not a huge fan of small school responses to disclosure, but if you do want to make them, there's some good literature that's written for like LD and policy that you can definitely steal and cut for responses that are like that. Yeah.
All right, I'll wait like an extra minute, and then if not, what's the reasoning for disclosure theory? There like some people read other standards and stuff. There's a real variety. Um, but of the few of the most popular are one, small schools. Um, by by mandating disclosure, now small schools have one, access to more arguments on the wiki, and two, they are now able to prep out big schools, because big schools are already prepping out small schools in the status quo, which means it's on that better for small schools. And then the second is like academic integrity. If you disclose all your evidence, that means I can actually check before round to see if your evidence is if it's miscut, which deters miscutting evidence in the first place.
Yeah.
So those are like the two like standards, like most well-known standards, but there's definitely more out there. You just have to think of a reason why like disclosure is good.
Yeah, like we were saying earlier in the lecture, standards can literally be anything as long as it like affects fairness, education, or like the safety of the round. So yeah, but the standards that Evan just gave are the most common ones, and it is probably what people will read if you hit disclosure theory, or if you want to run disclosure theory, is probably what you should be reading.
All right, I have time for like one more question because I think this ends at like 4:45.
Yeah.
But yeah. I hope everybody enjoyed it, learned something. Yeah, again, if any questions at all, just PM me on Discord or something, and I'll definitely get back to you. I do think theory is good. It's definitely good to like call out abuses to make the debate space more safe, more equitable for people. I think the biggest barrier to theory is not like knowing how to run theory, knowing what theory is, knowing how to respond, but once like the debate community like starts to learn that kind of stuff, I think theory can be a very like good tool in debate. All right. I think I'm gonna end it. But thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Jeremiah.
Yep.
So thank you. Have a nice day, everybody.